What about the historic nature of the Bible? Some people are like, I believe the Bible theologically, but it's not accurate historically. In fact, throughout time, throughout history, but well, I shouldn't say throughout history, since the Enlightenment really, people have liked to question the history of the Bible. Bart Ehrman, for instance, will question whether we've received the Bible accurately through generations. Bart Ehrman is the professor in charge of religion at North Carolina, University of North Carolina. And Ehrman likes to say, you can't trust the Bible because it has, like the New Testament, has been passed down to us kind of like the telephone game. You know, one person told another in the telephone game, and it's kind of like what begins as Mary had a little lamb ends as the Redskins win the pennant or something like that. It just doesn't make sense at all. But if anybody tells you that that's how we've gotten the Bible, they're either being deceptive or they're ignorant. The reality is the way that we got the Old Testament was there were scribes. Their profession was to copy not the pages, not the sentences, but the letters, letter by letter, and they counted them to know what the middle letters were in the books. In fact, you know what, good evidence for your ability to trust the Old Testament that you have? For years, the oldest extant copy of the Old Testament was dated to 900, AD 900. And then in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and they were dated to 200 to 300 years before Christ. So 1,000 years, conservatively, gap between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the what had been the latest or the earliest, whatever, the 900, the oldest copies of the Old Testament we have. And what do they find in the Dead Sea Scrolls except a copy of every single book in the Old Testament, except for the book of Esther, and they still only find that. It's a small book. When they compared what we have and what was written in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know what they found? Essentially no difference. A few little lines and things there, but that what Jesus said was really true. The Scriptures cannot be broken. You say, what about the New Testament? Can we trust the New Testament that what we have is accurate? There's a lot of work being done by this. In preparing for the message today, one of the people that I researched was a guy named J. Warner Wallace at Cold Case Christianity. This guy's really interesting because he was a cold case homicide investigator for Los Angeles for years. For 35 years, he was an atheist. Until he was 35 years old, he was an atheist. By the way, if you watch Dateline, if you're a Dateline watcher, he does investigations, has done investigations with them as well. But he says he used his cold case investigation techniques on Christianity and came to understand it's true. By the way, if you're going to study Christianity, he says you study it as a cold case. You know, you can't study it as a hot case. So we're lots of living people around. And so, by the way, if people want to use like unrealistic evidence, expectations for it, you just can't do that. It says, but he says he's never lost a cold case when he's brought into court. And he said this one he would not lose either. He gives 4 reasons why we can trust the New Testament. I will go in more detail perhaps this week when I do a devotion, so I'm going to go through them quickly. First of all, eyewitness accounts. Are they early or are they late? When the eyewitnesses to the event give the account, or do they come way later, or are they close to the event? Whenever somebody tells you that the New Testament was written late, again, it is by choice, it is not by facts. All the evidence is that most of the New Testament was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That means we have the Gospels, probably even the Gospel of John, written early in the 40s and 50s. Jesus' resurrection was AD 33. So we're talking within 10, 15, 20 years of the events. Second, he looks for corroborating touch points. So you have the eyewitness accounts. Do you have other accounts, little pieces of information here and there that corroborates what the witnesses say? Yes, we have the corroboration of Josephus and Pliny and Tacitus, for instance, and lots of corroboration by archaeology, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Third, have they been handed down faithfully? This is what he calls the chain of custody issue. And again, he would argue, yes, and I could go into more details this week, but basically you have the written accounts of the eyewitnesses and those who got from the eyewitnesses, and then those were handed down to their followers, to the church, to people like Ignatius and Polycarp and Papias. And the early church, by the end of the first century, had a group of New Testament books that were already accepted as authoritative. Some people will say, well, I thought that the New Testament was assembled by this group of people that were just kind of arbitrarily deciding what they wanted to be true and what wasn't true. No, by the end of the life of the apostles, there was already in the church an accepted, what they call canon of the New Testament. So when you say, well, what about the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Alfred E. Newman, or all those other Gospels? Those were Gnostic Gospels that were recognized early. First of all, they weren't first century. Second, they were recognized by the church as being heretical, and they were never accepted because they taught things that weren't true, and they weren't written by Thomas or Mary or Peter or those who were putting their names to it, whose name they put to it. F.F. Bruce is one of the leading scholars, New Testament scholars of the 20th century. When I was in college, it's like F.F. Bruce. I mean, you're just constantly reading F.F. Bruce. Bruce said, the church included the books we have in their canon because she already regarded them as divinely inspired, recognizing their innate worth and general apostolic authority, direct or indirect. This is by the end of the first century. So whenever they come along and say, well, they just kind of put them together after Constantine became emperor. This is how they talked back in the early days. I don't know. I was telling myself, Brett, don't talk like that. But it's just, anyway, I apologize. Aren't there a lot of mistakes in the manuscripts? Again, Bart Ehrman likes to say there are more mistakes in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That scare you? Well, it would if there were only 2 copies. And there's like all these copies, these 2 copies have all these differences. But the reality is there are over 6,000 copies of the New Testament in Greek alone, not counting Latin or Coptic or other languages, with a staggering 2.6 million pages of biblical text. Dan Wallace, no relation to Warner Wallace, although I think if you want to be a biblical scholar, having Wallace as a name may be helpful these days. But Dan Wallace, who is the leading expert on ancient biblical manuscripts. I mean, he's continually finding them and taking pictures to preserve them. It's just an amazing guy. He said this: the average classical Greek writer has less than 20 copies of his work in existence. Stack them up, and they're about 4 feet high. But if you stack up the copies of the New Testament manuscripts, they would be over a mile high. Imagine this. Your grandmother writes her recipe, and she hand copies, 10 copies for her children and grandchildren. And those children and grandchildren make copies, hand copies for other people. So they're like 2,000 hand copies of Grandma's recipe. And Grandma's recipe gets destroyed. Now, are there going to be some variations in those copies? Sure. But you bring all of those copies together, it's going to be pretty clear the things that are in common, therefore what the original recipe said. Why are there so many variations? You know what the variations are? They're things like this. Does it say Jesus Christ, Lord? Or does it say the Lord Jesus Christ? Or does it say Christ, the Lord Jesus? Each of those is considered a manuscript error because they are different from each other. Do they say anything different from each other? No. But the fact that you have so many manuscripts, an abundance that is an embarrassment of wealth, according to Daniel Wallace, that's why you have. The final thing is, are they biased? One of the most frustrating arguments that I hear is, and they'll love to say this because they feel like they can't be proven wrong. Those guys just made up what they wrote. Jesus didn't really call himself the Christ, didn't really call himself God, didn't really do those miracles. Those people just wrote it up. Okay, before calling somebody, we live in a time when if you disagree with somebody, let me say it like this, when somebody disagrees with somebody else, rather than just saying we disagree, they say they're a liar. And that's what people do with the Bible. You got to prove that the writers of the Bible are lying. What's the evidence that they are lying other than your accusation, other than your narrative that you want to affirm by calling them liars? Warner Wallace says, people do lie in testifying, but they always lie for one of three reasons. He says that in doing all of his cold cases, he's discovered there's no fourth reason for people to lie or to commit crimes. First, he says, it's for wealth. Second, it's for lust, relational or sexual. Third, it's for power. So ask, the writers of the New Testament, did they get money out of their lies? No, they all died in poverty. Did they get lots of girlfriends? No. Did they get lots of power? No. Again, they went to prison, they were tortured, they were beaten, most of them died as martyrs. This is not victor's history. Okay? One of the favorite arguments for people who try to tear down the Bible is, oh, the victors write the history, and these guys were the victors, and therefore they were just writing what they want. No, this is not victor's history. There's nothing to their advantage in what they wrote here. In fact, they wrote some things in here that are embarrassing to them. Judas betraying Jesus, Peter denying Jesus, Paul being a murderer. You don't write those things if you're making it up.